Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. In the part of the report on Latvia's security intended for the public, the Bureau for the Protection of the Constitution, one of the main intelligence services of the Republic of Latvia, talks about the possibility of the future. Russia's attacks on Latvia. Of course, the Latvian Special Service cannot say when this attack will take place and what the level of danger is. But perhaps the most important point in this report is that Russia is beginning to treat Latvia as Ukraine. And if we translate this thesis from the language of intelligence officers into a completely understandable expression, then we are talking about the fact that Russia ceases to perceive statehood. Latvia, as a kind of completed process, and begins to treat the neighboring state as a territory that should sooner or later return to Moscow's control. Latvian intelligence officers say that now the main activity of the Russian leadership is connected with the weakening of the West and the conduct of the whole. A number of sabotage and propaganda special operations related to this weakening. And part of such operations, of course, is the weakening of Latvia and other Baltic countries. Actually, there is really nothing sensational about the statement of a possible Russian attack on Latvia. In the Russian capital, all former Soviet republics were treated more like a misunderstanding. And at least in the Federal Security Service of Russia, these are the natural heirs of the USSR State Security Committee, have always believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the words of the KGB protégé as President of Russia Vladimir Putin, has become the largest geopolitical a disaster and, moreover, a mistake, which needs to be fixed. But until a certain time in the Baltic countries, it could be considered that this position applies primarily to the CIS member states. And Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia have taken the necessary measures to ensure their own safety. And, of course, the main decision of the Latvian government and the people of this country was to join the North Atlantic Alliance. Thus, Moscow, in the event of its attack on Latvia, she could be faced with a choice: try to regain the territory that was once part of the USSR and enter into conflict with the West, or abandon these intentions and act in the so-called gray zone. And, in fact, the Russian-Ukrainian war, from the point of view of the Russian political leadership, is precisely a war in a gray zone. Yes, European allies and the United States can help Ukraine repel Russian aggression. But nevertheless they do not consider themselves bound by specific obligations of protection Ukraine from this aggression. And that is why Russia consistently continues to insist that neither Ukraine nor other former Soviet republics. And we understand what is going on. And about those countries that have declared their Euro-Atlantic perspective, they cannot be members of NATO. And the alliance must guarantee this if it wants to end Russia's war against Ukraine. However, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia are already members of NATO. And it would seem this thesis does not apply to them. Although it should be remembered that in 2021, on the eve of Russia's big attack on Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs appealed to the US State Department and other foreign policy types. Western countries demanding that NATO guarantee its non-expansion at the expense of the former Soviet republics, and the withdrawal of troops from NATO member countries. Strategic weapons from the territory of those countries that joined the alliance after 1997. And of course, Latvia is also among these countries. Such a claim clearly spoke of Moscow's desire to restore the old Soviet sphere of influence. And it was about the Warsaw Pact, the former Soviet Union, and the countries of the former Yugoslavia. However, at least then, it was possible to count on Moscow not thinking about real aggression. The very weakening of NATO may whet Russia's appetite. Now the most important question that no one has the answer is simple enough question, as will the United States to protect Baltic countries if troops enter their territory, the Russian Federation, or if Russia starts a hybrid war against these countries, for example, on the border territories, or the White House will limit itself to statements and an attempt to negotiate with Moscow, the way it is happening now in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And since no one can give a clear answer to this question, and therefore no one knows whether the famous fifth article of NATO really works, countries like Latvia really need to worry. To worry, first of all, because Russia has changed its attitude to the statehood of the former Soviet republics. Changed dramatically, and now her attitude to sovereignty. The neighboring countries depend primarily on whether they will be able to fend off Russian aggression, and whether they will be provided with effective assistance so that Russian aggression does not occur. Secondly, we have to worry about the changed position of the United States in relation to Europe, and indeed, if the President of the United States can question the sovereignty of Denmark, explaining this in the interests of the national security of the United States, then will the sovereignty of the Baltic countries not be called into question if it turns out that their defense also contradicts. It contradicts American national interests, as it will lead to a direct collision with the largest nuclear state in the modern world. Perhaps that is why the Latvian Constitution Protection Bureau states this serious concern. In connection with the possible Russian aggression, and with the possible weakening of the West in the next year, and with Russia's intentions to contribute to this weakening. And here, of course, the only real answer remains: the readiness of Western countries to overcome the difficulties that have arisen, and the ability to think not only about the effectiveness of existing unions, but also about the real prospect of creating new unions, which will no longer depend on anything to fear because of the clash with Moscow. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel. Subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, to the channels in Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee and Donatella, which help to develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function in YouTube itself. Peace to you.